Hi y'all, a couple of news items to talk about. The first of which is something I noticed was going to be coming up soon because I watch C-SPAN. I'm sure a lot of you spend a lot of your time watching C-SPAN just like I do. And Secretary Pompeo was testifying before one of the committees. And one of the questions he was asked was about the release of information related to being able to 3D print guns. And I'm like, oh, this would be interesting that the agreement was supposed to expire soon, and if he would take a look at not releasing it because, or doing something to intervene because they don't want it released, and it would be in the hands of terrorists overseas, and that helps stop the spread of the proliferation of various firearms and whatnot. And then, so I just stuck that away in my memory bank, like I do with so many things I see on C-SPAN. I thought, this might come up again in the future sometime soon. And lo and behold, it has. Alyssa Milano on CNN has written an op-ed. And apparently, she has discovered that there exist such things as downloadable blueprints to print 3D components to firearms. Now, about 5 or 6 years ago, I did a video when I first started doing videos on firearms, and I mentioned this, and I was like, one day in the future, they're going to get much better with this technology. At the time, they could fire a couple of hundred rounds before the receiver would fail. There's a company working on it out of, I think, Texas. I was like, so what are you going to do in the future when they actually do perfect this technology and the price of these printers comes down? Are you going to have some law, some new legislation that needs to be proposed that, I don't know what it's going to look like, but that prevents making these in your home, perhaps banning types of printers or materials that can be used to make various components for firearms? How are you going to get around that? Because this technology is going to make it very difficult to do anything but on an individual level prosecute people for possession of a weapon that is made by that means. And the left has discovered that today. Alyssa Milano is outraged, and she has now come to realize, well, it was obvious to anyone who pays attention to the conversation and knows anything about firearms and technology years and years ago, that this is a game-changing technology because these blueprints exist. And, the fact that they exist in the United States and they may be withheld here doesn't mean they can't be invented somewhere else. I mean, it is, after all, just a program that tells a printer how to contrive a particular component. And apparently they've gotten much better with the technology than they were with it 5 or 6 years ago when I first mentioned it, and predicted that we would eventually reach this state where there's going to be an outrage about it. And now we're here. So I thought that was interesting. Another issue that came up is the shooting death of, I hope I get the guy's name right, Thurman Blevins in Minnesota. And they have released the video of the shooting, and I've heard 3 versions of what happened, one of which is consistent with the video, and 2 of which aren't consistent with the video. One of which is that, I'll go with the inconsistent ones first. The first inconsistent version that I've heard is from eyewitnesses who claim the guy did not have a firearm. And looking at the video, he very obviously did have a firearm, and after he was shot and fell, you could see the firearm in his hand, you could see the firearm fall out of his hand and land on the road. Obviously a firearm. The police were called because a man who was supposedly drinking had discharged the firearm into the air. So, but nevertheless, the witnesses in that particular community, some of the eyewitnesses claimed, obviously they had a good view of it because they always do when they can tell you didn't do nothing. So he didn't do nothing, but magically the police managed to stash the gun on him, I guess, while he was falling in mid-air, and then have it tumble out of his hands, and they did that in the open, in a great David Copperfield moment. No one noticed. Brilliant move. Okay, maybe not. The second false version was actually from a spokesman, a lieutenant, somebody or other, for the Fraternal Order of Police, or their version of the Fraternal Order of Police, who was claiming, and this was run with by the local news station as though it's the gospel, that the officers were justified in firing because the guy turned and fired at the police officers, which in turn justified their use of deadly force against him. And they even had a little clip from the shooting that had red circles drawn around the gun. And so I look at those pictures and I thought, well, yeah, I see the gun. But something doesn't quite match up here, so I was wondering, well, I've seen the video. I don't remember this scene when the shooting started. So I scrubbed through the video until I found the exact frames. The part of the video being shown by the spokesperson for the police fraternity, their union or whatever, that is claimed by him to justify their shooting, is what was happening to the guy as he was being shot to death. After he'd been shot 3 or 4 times, he turns and is falling. So the guy would have had a great argument if the guy had done that before he was shot, but he didn't. He did that after he'd been shot several times, and whether or not he was violating the law beforehand, I think after you've been shot, it's perfectly reasonable to try to defend yourself, even if you weren't doing the right thing in the first place. I think it's just, you know, something that people do. Call me crazy. So that guy is either a very shitty spokesman who can't be bothered to learn anything about the facts and just misspoke, which I find highly unlikely given that they had excerpts from the video to present to the media in order to argue the case that the shooting was justified because the guy shot at the cop, which is why the cops were justified at shooting him, even though they had shot him 3 or 4 times by the time he did that. So I'm very politely saying the guy's a liar. It was very orchestrated as a lie on his part, and they should immediately fire this man and issue a public apology begging for forgiveness for having let someone who was such an obvious liar represent the police. Who knows if that's happening right now? I doubt it. And then the other was from the prosecutor. And the prosecutor said, we think that it was justified. The man was armed. It is credible what the officer said they saw. It's consistent with what's on the tape, or on the recording. It's not even a tape. It's digital now. It's so fancy. I don't want to date myself, but, you know, get out the VCR and plug that puppy in. That the guy was armed. He wasn't responding to commands. I mean, all that's clearly on the video. And that at some point right before the shooting happened, the guy reached in his pocket, which is where the firearm was, and pulled it out, and that's when the officer stopped. He planted himself, took aim, and he started shooting, and so did his partner. And it's perfectly consistent with the video. So I think on that, it is a reasonable, even if it was the wrong decision, it was a reasonably wrong decision to have engaged in deadly force. And I don't think it was a reasonably wrong decision. I think it was a reasonably just decision, because you don't want to put the police in the kind of situation, or anyone in the kind of situation who's dealing with a person who's drunk, armed, has already discharged his weapon, or supposedly discharged his weapon recklessly, into the position where it's not enough that the guy actually reaches for the gun and gets it in his hand. That isn't even enough for you to say, well, now I have cause. You have to wait until presumably he turns around and takes aim, but that's not a reasonable expectation to put on anyone. I think sad, justified. The people who are protesting it is just part of the way the leftists work. So there's that, and I'll talk more about the leftists' strategy in a minute, but I want to talk about the Mueller investigation, you know, the witch hunt. It's interesting because the prosecution of Manafort, the judge has laid out some rules for the prosecution. They can't mention Trump, they can't mention the campaign, they can't mention Russia, and they can't mention any type of collusion. So I was like, well, that's very interesting. I wonder how this is going to get spun. And I was watching CNN, and lo and behold, they had a guy on there who was saying, oh no, the reason we cared about Manafort had nothing to do with collusion in Russia. Nothing to do. The only reason that we Democrats have been interested in the Manafort thing and talking about the Manafort thing is because Trump is supposedly a good judge of character, and he chose this guy who had been committing crimes to be part of his campaign. That's the only reason Manafort has ever been in it. I'm like, this is complete bullshit. It's been Trump, collusion, Russia, that's been the narrative. And for those of you who don't know about leftist strategies, there are 2 major things that you could look at that will give you a summary of, it will give you the overview of how they work and what it is their ultimate goals are, how it is they seek to achieve their ultimate goals of power. So this tactic that is the most common, it's what the protesters are doing with respect to the Blevins shooting, Black Lives Matter, hands up, don't shoot, didn't do nothing, that kind of thing. The sticking to the Trump collusion, Russia narrative. It's the 13th rule from Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, and it is pick a target, freeze that target, and then you personalize it, and then you polarize it, and you have to stick to it. Now, this is in line with some Soviets, right? For this, you can look up Yuri Bezmenov, who was a former KGB operative who defected to Canada, and he gave a whole bunch of talks and did some writings in Canada and the United States in the 80s, and I think early 90s. And one of them was the 4 major components to the Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, communist, socialist kind of way of viewing the world, how they seek to influence other countries, particularly ones like the United States, where they know that there's nothing they can do directly that will defeat the United States. The Soviet Union was under no illusions that it was a military rival force. The only people who thought there was actually parity between the United States military and the Soviet military were people who were being lied to during the various elections, when the president who was in office could not dispel the lies of the candidate on the other side, who was claiming various advances in the Russian military that didn't exist, and how there's this disparity between they're so much more advanced than we are. It just wasn't true. But the president couldn't just say, well, no, here's what we know, here's why we know it. So the sitting president couldn't talk because it was classified, and if he was going to be honest with the electorate, he would have to betray methods and sources. The candidate knew that he couldn't correct the falsity, knew that it was false, and kept telling the lie. That's one of the funny things about being in power. You can be the most powerful person in the world, but you're the only one who can't really clear up the record because you'd be abdicating your responsibility. That was back when we had government officials who actually cared, when they were in office. So there's that. Yuri Bezmenov, I'll put a link to it below, and same with Saul Alinsky. So read Rules for Radicals. You don't have to read the whole literature, just get the topics. It's a big clue as to what it's about. So the 13th rule is pick a target, focus the target, make it emotional, personalize it, and then polarize it, which is what they do. And then with the 4 steps that Yuri lays out, the first one is demoralization, and then destabilization, and then the latter 2 are the crisis and renormalization. We don't have to really worry about those 2. Now, in the 80s, he was talking about how when he defected to the West, he was surprised that the program was as far advanced as it was in the United States. That he was one of those people who was saying, you've got, if you start right now, it's going to take you a generation to correct this. One of the reasons that one of the things that bedeviled him was he, like a lot of people, underestimate the United States. And one of the reasons they do this is because they come from societies that are artificially arrived at. They weren't intelligently designed from the outset. The United States is the first country where it was sat down and planned. Not just, oh, well, we need an executive, we'll have an executive. We need some courts, we'll have some courts. Every bit of it was set out. And Madison was a big driver of this. One of the things that Madison did was he collected a library of books of history and different forms of government that have existed throughout all of history. So massive that it actually taxed his personal fortune to pay for the books. It strained his own personal finances to cover the expenditure of the books. And he read all of them. He studied them, and studied them, and studied them, and studied them. And he found, why is it that confederations in the past have failed? And the counterintuitive part about the country is because the whole system is designed to keep power in check. And the counterintuitive part of it is you make every group powerful. That's the trick. You want to make sure that each of the distinct entities has some kind of power that is not available to the others, or not as much available to the others, so that way they can all fight it out. And in the worst case scenarios, short of war, what you create is a massive gridlock where the government and the different entities are incapable of getting anything done. And the idea there is, if they can't get anything done, then they're not doing any bad things either. So that in and of itself, the gridlock in and of itself, is protective of liberty. So you have the 3 major components of the United States. You have the United States, the federal government. You have the states, the several states. And then you have the citizens, the polity. And the trick is, the reason the Second Amendment is there is to make sure that among other things that citizens can do, they individually have in their possession, as they should like, the weapons that are sufficient to be a check, even if they're not capable of defeating any particular force. It is at least a threat. And I know there's a lot of idiots who watch my channel and say, oh, you'd stand no chance with you, meaning me personally, you would stand no chance with your deer rifle against a tank. You're right, I wouldn't. I fully concede that if you have a tank and me, I'm probably going to be the one who loses. But the calculus changes when it's a tank versus, or even dozens of tanks, or hundreds of tanks, or thousands of tanks, versus 20, 30, 40 million people with rifles. And the reason the calculus changes is precisely because it is not possible to both defeat and occupy an enemy from within tanks. At some point, you have to get out of the tanks, you have to get out of the airplanes, and send in the fleshy little troops who are just as vulnerable to bullets today as they were 10 years ago, as they were 50 years ago, as they were 200 years ago. The bullets cut through them just the same. And for an idea, look at Afghanistan right now, where the United States didn't learn any lessons from other failed people. Not since Alexander the Great has anybody been successful at invading and conquering Afghanistan. We haven't done it. The Soviets couldn't do it. The two great superpowers were incapable of doing it. And at no point in any time that we've been in Afghanistan have we faced more than just a few thousand fighters. It started off with just a few hundred. We were doing well then. And then a few thousand. And that's it. There's never been more than that. And their most advanced technology is a rifle and a donkey, or a rifle and a moped, and then whatever they can fashion together that'll blow up on the side of the road. That is the extent of their arsenal. And they still control more than half the country. Just FYI for those people, you can't do anything with the rifles. I think we're slightly more sophisticated in the United States than having just rifles, mopeds, and donkeys. We've got a little bit better technology in the hands of the citizens. So, bite me. Don't. I'm not into that. Not my kind of thing. Call me. No, anyway. So, Yuri Bezmenov and other people, if you think this isn't still ongoing, the attempts to demoralize and destabilize, go look at the Confucius centers that China has in the United States. You know, kind of a hands across the sea gesture. Trojan horse. So, communists have been trying this for decades, and they always think, like Bezmenov did, that they're right at the destabilization phase, and they never are. And the reason for it is they don't understand the inherent strength in the diffusion of power, and you concentrate power within these different entities, so that way they all have a good amount of power, but then you make them responsible for different things. That's what a constitution is. It means structure. The structure of the government is really, really important. It was intelligently designed precisely to be able to defeat this kind of stuff. Now, one of Bezmenov's solutions is, once you're at the stage between demoralization and destabilization, you have fewer options than you have at the outset. So now, what you in the States need to think about is not allowing their propaganda in. And I say, no! Let the Russian propaganda in. Let the Chinese propaganda in. Let it all in. That is the strength, not a weakness of our system. That anybody can come here and say whatever they want. And they don't understand how that pendulum works. Yes, sometimes it swings in one direction, but it rebounds. And, you know, it's easy to say we're at the destabilization phase because there's always a source of conflict. There's always some problem somewhere you can point to and go, this is the sign that presages the doom, the fall of the country. And for, 70 years now, they've been, oh yeah, we're right at the crisis phase. That's what they seek, is the crisis phase, because that's where the collapse happens, and that can happen very quickly. And it's happened very quickly in other countries, but they didn't have our structure. They did not have the way that we separate powers and the distrust that we have of government, but the necessity of having things that have power to get stuff done. And you have that inherent chaos and order built into the system. So that creates a certain degree of instability in the system. If you look at it very close up, there's always a bit of give and take. But if you look at it on the long term, it's actually quite stable. It is brilliant. It's counterintuitive as hell, but brilliant. And it's working. That's all I can say. So, they're always trying to do the demoralization bit, which is where you sow distrust. It's ideological subversion. Colleges are great at this. And Bezmenov and others will talk about how this is where the threat's going to come from. That is one of the vectors of the threat. But most Americans don't go to college. They don't get that indoctrination. So the people who come out of these liberal schools, the liberal arts schools, this doesn't happen in trade schools, by the way. It's only among the academically elite or profane and idiots. They come out and they can only talk to themselves. And since they can't talk beyond their own little echo chamber, they don't get the kind of purchase that they believe they should be getting. They think they've got the solutions, and they overestimate a different part. This is where they overestimate the power of the United States, whereas the other side, on the ideological front, is underestimating the power of the United States. They overestimate it on the resource bit, economics. They think that because we're very successful at the things that we do, and that there's this kind of idea in the United States that if we can't do it right, then it can't be done. And they take that and kind of run with it. They think, well, that means we can do anything, and anything we touch will turn to gold. We don't have the Midas touch. Even the United States cannot get around the laws of economics. Socialism will not work for any large population, period. It is always doomed to failure. Not in the, I don't mean like in the infinite time frame that waits for the rest of the universe before it goes to heat death. I mean in, the medium term. It just is always inherently unstable. And one of the reasons for it is that it cannot accurately predict the price of things because it doesn't know. The population doesn't know the price of things because the price of things is not organically determined. It is by fiat. Miracle, it will be that price. And you go, okay. It doesn't matter whether it's actually worth that in fact or not. That's what the people will be paying. And, if you think about how the USSR fell, it was going to fall anyway. Reagan helped it along by economic means, by making it economically not viable for them to try to keep up with a free enterprise system they had no hope of competing with. And this notion that it's the Republicans that Putin would have wanted in office is retarded. The only people who have ever been a threat, except for JFK, the only people, the only Democrat who's ever a threat to the USSR was JFK. All the rest of them have been sniveling little appeasers. Détente, it's appeasement. It's only the Republicans that actually would say, to the USSR, this will mean war. Don't cross this. It will not be good. And JFK. So other than that, all the rest of the presidents in between, even some of the Republicans, I have to say, were complete shit on the Russia issue. It was Reagan. And then, we saw the same left-wing pusillanimity in Clinton. He was smart enough to recognize what the threats were, but he was and is a coward. That's why we have the North Korea problem we have today. The one president we had in place who could have done something chose to engage in a little bit of Potemkin Village-type negotiations. And that's why you got the agreed framework. And then the only president we've had since Clinton, before Trump, who actually had spine to act, was too fucking stupid to be able to pick an enemy. I mean George Bush, just in case people were confused. The man was, like, virtually retarded. It was, the Afghanistan thing, yeah, that was good. They were harboring the people who actually came and killed our people. I understand that. Iraq had nothing to do with it. North Korea was right there. It was worried about people, on the verge of getting a nuclear arsenal. It was North Korea the whole time. It was Colonel Mustard, in the lab with Dick Cheney. That's what happened. But he was too stupid. And then we got Obama, who was both too stupid and too weak. And then, now we've got Trump, who I'm still on the fence whether he's insane or very bright and really good at deflection. I think that he's really good at distracting people, because I keep noticing that he's hitting the majority of his policy points. He's managing to pull off while dangling the keys off to the side. And because leftists like that 13th rule of Alinsky, you've got to pick the target, freeze the target, personalize it, and polarize it. The problem with that is you have to pick the target. Trump is the one picking the targets for them. They're really good at the freezing it, personalizing it, making it emotional, and polarizing it. It's not getting them anywhere. So I guess there's some brilliance there. I don't know whether that's Trump or his handlers, but whatever. So anyway, the United States is constantly in a state of flux between demoralization, I cannot say that word today for some reason, and destabilization. And the reason for it is that the distrust of institutions is inherent in the system. It's hard to say, well, what's going to happen if, the states don't trust the federal government? Oh, yeah, that'd be terrible. God, that would be like the system that the framers invented. I mean, where we want the federal government to have a certain amount of powers, but we don't trust it to have any more because you can't trust power. Well, what if the citizens don't trust their state? Yeah, what if? Oh my God, that would be terrible. It would be almost like the kind of conditions where you might, if you were inventing something intelligently, say, well, what we should have is a strong state, but an armed populace that can resist the strong state, and an armed populace and strong states that can resist the federal. It's almost like distrust of power and a healthy cooperative mistrust of different components of the government is right there in the system. That's why they never get past into the demoralization stage, right into the destabilization stage, in order to bring about the crisis stage, and let alone the renormalization. And it's precisely because the thing they're going after is built into the system. And it is of course true that a large tree can be felled by the same means as a small tree It just takes a longer period of time and stronger wax. The difficulty is that it takes not the 10 years, not the 15 years, not the one generation that the Soviets plan on. It's going to take several generations of pushing a particular set, not even one. You need an entire set of different ways of ideological subversion, that by the time that that set gets in there, the next generation is already like used to it. And they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. So we've got those nut jobs there, we've got these nut jobs here. You know, it just takes so long to get it through a system this large, by design. I mean, that's what the idea of unfettered speech provides you. You always have many bulwarks against this. Before you can really get a narrative driving, it takes you a lot of time, which means that it's harder for ideological fixity to sweep the nation, because you just have different pockets. And that's one of the tricks of the American system, is you want to make sure that it's designed in such a way that no single faction at any time gets too much power, that there's always a way to counterbalance it. And this is incidentally why I want conservative, I mean extremely conservative judges. Not because I think that the policies that are enacted by any government are good and should be the law of the land for all time, for all purposes, but it's precisely because having a conservative judiciary is a way of making political mistakes less costly in the long run, because well, for one, it sets accountability. It's not the judges. You're not looking to the judges to set policy and to change things the way that you want it. So the blame will lie with the Congress or the President or at the state level, state legislatures, governor, that kind of thing. Two, it means that the political branches can only go so far so fast, because you've always got those curmudgeonly conservative judges and they're going, I'm sorry, you can't do that. Strike it down. We're not going to enforce it. And then you say, oh, well, golly gee, we can't do this. And it's important to have that. Judges, even liberal judges, by their nature, are still somewhat conservative. And if you want to have a great example of how it works, having a bunch of conservative judges in the system to make sure that the government doesn't go too far too fast, and that if it does if something in the Constitution proves inconvenient, we can just repeal it. Not the way that we've done things, though. We've never stripped out a liberty that was enumerated in it, and we've added a lot more to it over time, so there's that. But anyway, look at the Obama administration. It was the most lawless administration in my lifetime, and probably most of your lifetimes. Not since the FDR Truman period, and not before that, not after, except for Obama, has there been a more lawless executive. It is ordinarily the case that the government wins in the appellate courts, actually in the trial courts too. They win 65 to 80% of their cases regularly. I mean, it's just a given. It's very rare that when you go up against the government, you're going to prevail. And the reason for that is not that the government is so powerful and the judges are kissing its ass. It's that they know they have to do certain things a certain way, and if they don't, they lose. So they do those things. Even if they don't want to, they've got to get it through the court, so they've got to do these things, and, it works. Obama said, no, I've got a phone and I've got a pen. The Obama administration, the only administration of my lifetime, that lost 65 to 70% of its cases. It lost almost all the time, because Obama and his Solicitor General and his Attorney General were that untethered to the United States Constitution. They were that uninterested. They were at that destabilization phase, and they failed. And they failed precisely because the founders who set out this country were exceptionally brilliant. They were drawn from all parts of the land, and they didn't say, hey, send me your idiots. The people would look around and say, who's the smartest among us? Who are the bright ones? Who are the well-spoken ones? Who are the ones who understand our issues best? Yes, send that guy. And so you had a whole bunch of really smart people who were able to compromise their way to solutions. It's not a perfect document. It's not meant to be perfect. It admits, even before it was written, that it's right there in the preamble. Hey, we're starting off with the idea that we're imperfect. The best we can do is try to strive for something that's more perfect than what we have now. We'll never reach it, but we can always try to do a little better. And so you had all these wonderfully brilliant people sitting there, and they would think about, what happens if this group has this power? How do you counter that? And you think about it, well, you would do this. Well, what's the counter to that? And they think about it, oh, well, how about this? And that. And they did this for months, batting it around, and then you send things to the language committee, the SIL committee, to kind of like put a gloss on it. But the nuts and the bolts of it was set up, how do we make sure that the government is capable, has a proper amount of power to do the things we need a government to do, but that if it tries to exceed that power in some arbitrary, some capricious, or some terrible tyrannical way, that there is something somewhere else in the system, organic to it, that can't be gotten away with, can't be done away with, that is sufficient to put it down. And the idea was, make everybody powerful. So you separate the powers in the federal government. You have an executive who does executive things that he can't be frustrated in by either of the other two branches, but that he needs to depend on them for other things in order to do the things that are core to him. He can't fund himself. He relies on the Congress. And you have the Congress. It can't execute the laws, but it can write the laws. But it can only write certain laws. And then you have the judiciary, the least dangerous branch, they said, who has neither will nor power. They have only judgment. Who enforces the court's decrees? The court can't. It's the president. The process that's issued from the Supreme Court is issued in the name of the President of the United States. It's not issued in the Supreme Court's name. All of its process is served in the name of the President, because they depend on the President to execute their judgments, to enforce their judgments. And if the President says no, they are powerless. The most they can say is, well, we told you to do it. And then what happens? It's up to the Congress. If the Congress is not going to impeach and convict the President and remove him, then, oh well. If the courts get off the rail, you can always impeach, convict them, or you can cut off their funding and all kinds of things. But with the core functions that are inherent to the judiciary, nobody interferes with that. To the core functions that are executive, Congress is always trying to interfere with that. Look at the War Powers Act. It seems to believe that it can decide when the president must report to it about military action. That's not true. The Constitution says that the Congress has the power to declare the war. It has the power to raise the armies. But who leads it once it's been raised? The president. Who can oversee that? Nobody. The Congress's only options are disband the military entirely or stop all funding. Those are its two options. And it doesn't want to make use, as Dick Durbin I think has said it. It's not practical to think that we could do that today. Oh, it might not be practical. You might not have the political will to exercise your lawful and just powers. But the fact that you're too politically weak, that you're too spineless, is not a license to go around claiming powers that aren't granted to you in order to make up for the fact that you're a pussy. It just does not work that way. So you have that problem. And it's like, well, hey, look, I feel for you, Congress people. It must really be unfortunate that you're all that politically weak and spineless, but that is the price of your political cowardice. That you lack political will. You don't feel strongly about this. It's not worth it to you. Well, I guess in those circumstances, the president should be the more powerful because he's willing to act and you're not. And, so you have that kind of thing. There is something in there. There is a bludgeon that every group gets. That's just in the federal government to mess with the other two. And whenever any two of the branches decide that the third has exceeded its proper bounds, that is the constraint. And then if that fails, you have the militias in the several states and the militaries in the several states. So there is ample... This idea of this friction, what if people are, disaffected here? What if they're usurped? It is all factored in ab initio. It's baked in. It is organic to the United States. And that's why they underestimate it from abroad. You can't just push a little bit here and push a little bit there and expect it's going to fall over. And then if you do push too hard, we're going to notice, and you're going to get fucked because you're trying to take us on directly. And if you're subtle about it, it takes too long for you to get that idea out there, for it to permeate the entire society in any kind of way that it is what is driving the narrative. So they're always stuck between that and the destabilization, which is where they actually start attacking centers of economics, the military, government centers, things of that nature, food supplies and whatnot. You're nowhere near that. You can't compete with us economically. Our supply chain is too diversified, and if all that fails, the military is such that, I hate listening to Republicans talk about we need to rebuild the military and we're weak, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there are some things we need to do. But if you take the next 10, there is no combination of 10 countries outside of the United States that you can put together that is a rival to our military. And I don't even mean like it'll be close, they might win. They're not nearly our equal. You could put all the entire European Union's military together. You could give it all of Europe, one military, and they would still need a little bit of help outside to rival us. Our military is that powerful. I have no idea what that was. I think it was a phone.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, okay. It could have been a strange fire alarm. Oh, it sounds like a friendly fire. I've heard of friendly fire on the news. They seem to allege something bad. Anyway, All of that is built right in, and that's why the Soviets failed, and that's why the Chinese are failing. But they're still trying because, you know, monkey see, monkey do. And the leftists in the United States do copy. Monkey see, monkey do. They do copy a lot of it. They're just much less effective at it. And it has just struck me as amusing. I thought I would just put that all that out there for you to look at or to listen to. So read Saul Alinsky, check out Yuri Bezmenov. I don't agree with everything that Bezmenov has to say in the way of curing the problem, because I understand the American system better than he does. And you know, he spins off into this big, you need to have God, you've got to have religion in order to keep these things in check. And it's not true. God is one way to do it. The generalization of the proposition that you need to have a deity of some type is simply that you need to have something that people consider to be greater than themselves that's worth trusting in. You can do that and through secular means, like a secular religion, like, you know, the way the Constitution plays itself out in the lives of everyday ordinary Americans when they're actually going through their lives. It isn't, oh God, this, oh God, all the, you know, it's my rights, the Constitution, that kind of thing. You can do it like that. You can do it with God. There are lots of different things that you can do it with. But he is stuck in the idea that it must be God. No, you just need some moral precept and something that people can rightly look at as being supreme to them, to which they're willing to subject themselves in certain kinds of ways. The Constitution does it for me. God does it for other people. Whatever. I'm not here to quibble with people why they do things nicely. I'm not. I don't try to look behind look behind the horse's mouth too much. What is it? Gift horse in the mouth? Yeah, that's it. I don't try to do that. It's like, look, you're not out murdering and raping people. All right, I'm sure you have your reasons. I'm not going to push you on them. It works for me. All right, have a great day.